Just about half a century ago, actually it was in 1964, I finished my surgical residency here at the University of Pennsylvania, and I was looking for a job. The only research I had done during my residency was in GI physiology, and there was not a spot here at Penn, I knew, for someone to catch on as a young surgeon working in the GI field. So I looked around and I thought, well, you know, there's one thing that's not being done here at Penn that is being done in some other places, and that's transplantation. And so I decided I would see if I could get some experience in transplantation. There was no transplantation going on at Penn, but it was anticipated that when it was done, it would be done by the senior vascular surgeon, Brick Roberts. So I decided when I finished my surgical residency, I would take an extra year of vascular surgery working with Brick Roberts, and during that year I was anticipating that he would do a kidney transplant. As it turned out, he didn't get it done. And yet there were occasional meetings with a small group that was interested in transplantation that included Rupert Billingham, who at that time was at the Wistar Institute across the street from our hospital. And so I had met Billingham once or twice by going to these meetings to talk about transplantation. The other people who came to the meetings were the nephrologists, who were dead set against transplantation. They thought it was too early, the results were too poor, and it was not something that should be done at an institution like the University of Pennsylvania. So I was a little discouraged with that, and at the end of that year of vascular surgery, I still didn't have a job offer. So I decided that I would find out whether I could spend some time working with Billingham, and that might give me some extra ammunition for getting a job. So I went over to the Wistar Institute and talked to Billingham, and he immediately accepted me as a fellow in his department. He, and also he told me Medawar, were very glad to get surgeons to come and work with them. And Paul Russell was one of those, and there were others who worked with Medawar. They liked surgeons because they knew the surgeons could work endless hours and wouldn't complain and would just do what they were told, which is the way it turned out. And as it turned out, Billingham was just at that time, at the end of in the summer of 1965, was moving across the street from the Wistar Institute to become the chairman of genetics at the University of Pennsylvania and in our School of Medicine. So I was coming into his laboratory at a very favorable time, and it was especially favorable, as it turned out, because he had worked with Willis Silvers up until that time, who was his first recruit, but they had pretty much come to the end of the projects they were working on, and so Billingham sort of took me on as a younger colleague, and from then on, for the next 6 years, we worked as lab partners. In fact, the laboratory in a new building that was not too old at that time, the laboratory that we worked in was one that my surgical chairman, Dr. Rhodes, paid to have built in the basement of the Richards building. And Billingham moved in there with me, and we worked on projects together. The other thing that was very fortunate was that after we had been working together for about 6 months, I guess, and we were working on the rather esoteric subject of privileged sites, immunologically privileged sites, which was one of Billingham's interests. And we were in the middle of a project that he was very interested in with privileged sites. And he didn't want me to leave. And as the end of the year approached, he could see that I was now going out and interviewing for jobs elsewhere, and he wanted me to stay around so we could finish that project. And so he decided that he would influence Dr. Rhodes and influence the nephrologists to let me start a kidney transplant program, which amazingly enough they did. I was, and when I did the first one, I didn't have a faculty appointment. I was a fellow in Billingham's lab. I don't even think I had malpractice insurance at the time. That was not a big issue at the time. I'm not quite sure why it wouldn't have been an issue, because the results were not very good. But anyway, so during the middle of that year that I was a fellow with Billingham, I did the first kidney transplant at the University of Pennsylvania. Again, there was a lucky thing that happened. We happened to choose a living donor that we later found out was an HLA identical match with the recipient, and that transplant went off very smoothly. And in fact, that patient lived for the next 49 years and became one of only maybe a dozen in the world that had maintained a kidney transplant for that long. And then at the end of that year, Billingham and I were still getting along very well, still working on projects that were interesting to both of us. And so he offered me an appointment, a junior faculty appointment in his department. And I spent the next 6 years as a junior member of his department of genetics, as well as a junior member of the Department of Surgery, doing vascular surgery to make a living, because there was certainly no way to make a living doing transplantation at that time. It wasn't even paid for. It was done out of the Clinical Research Center, and there was no reimbursement for transplantation at all. But it was a way to catch on, and I got a job because of meeting Billingham, and because of working with him, and because of the way that transplantation started out at the University of Pennsylvania. He told me everything. We got to be great friends, actually, and we spent a lot of time together. When I went to England, I guess for the first meeting of the Transplantation Society in Paris, I stayed with Billingham's parents in Wheatley, a little town near Oxford, and got to be good friends with his parents, actually. So we were that close. But he told me all about his early days. His grandfather was a dairy farmer. His father was a butcher. He grew up in this little town near Oxford and went to Oxford and did very well in school there, and then was taken on as Medawar's first graduate student. That was just after World War II ended. During the war, he was on a submarine, on a destroyer, on submarine patrol and working with radar and so on. And since he had always wanted to go to sea, that was a very satisfying experience for him. And then when he came back from the war, he became Billingham's first graduate student. And they worked together not on transplantation, which Medawar was not interested in at the time, really. They worked together on pigment spread. And in guinea pigs, they grafted autografts, skin autografts from black and white spotted guinea pigs. And they were very interested in the aspect that when they grafted a piece of black skin onto a donor, a recipient site that was white, the pigment would spread out into the surrounding tissue. They thought that that something in the pigment infected the cells in the white skin. As it turned out later on, they were wrong about that. It was actually the cells, the pigmented cells that spread out. Anyway, that's what they were working on. That was Billingham's thesis, and his first 8 papers were in pigment spread. And then, as it happened, Billingham was at a conference with a veterinary colleague there, and a veterinarian, and by then he had actually moved to Birmingham from Oxford. And he was at a conference with this veterinarian who was a colleague, and the veterinarian was interested in distinguishing fraternal from identical twins in cattle. The purpose of that being that the female of a twin pair, fraternal twin pair, would be sterile, and there would be no real point in raising them because they would not be they would not be able to give birth or milk, I guess. So that was of interest to this veterinarian. He was talking to Medawar about it, and Medawar said, well, that's easy. Just do exchange skin grafts, and you'll be able to tell because the identical twins will accept the grafts, the fraternal ones will reject them. And Medawar was sorry that he had told this story to the veterinarian because the veterinarian then wanted him to do skin grafting experiments. And Medawar didn't want to do that for two reasons. One is that the farm where the veterinarian kept the cattle was about 2 hours from Birmingham. And the other reason was that Medawar was afraid of cows. He didn't like to work with large animals. And so he enlisted Billingham, who by then had moved to Birmingham as a junior faculty member with Medawar. Medawar knew that Billingham had grown up on his grandfather's dairy farm and therefore would not object to working with cows. And also Billingham was an expert in skin grafting, so that was a natural. So the two of them went off to Cold Norton Farm near Birmingham and exchanged skin grafts between these pairs of twin cattle. It was something that Billingham liked because he liked Medawar's technician, Jane Morpeth, who after a year or so he married. But the research project was not going so well because they found that most of the skin grafts were not rejected, whether the cows were identical or fraternal twins. Most of the grafts were accepted, and they couldn't figure out what the reason for that was. And they were casting around to try and explain it as they were thinking that they would write this up. And then, as it turned out, their colleague, whose name was Hugh Donald, told them about a paper that had been published in Science 5 years before, in which it had been noted that twin cattle usually shared red cell types. And Ray Owen at the University of Wisconsin was the guy who had published that paper. Incidentally, I had dinner with Ray Owen a few years ago and asked him whether he thought he should have a share of that Nobel Prize. He was a very modest guy, and he said no, he thought that Medawar deserved it. But the other guy who might have deserved a share of it was Hugh Donald, who called their attention to this paper of Ray Owen's. Well, once they knew that red blood cells survived into adulthood in cattle, and that the reason was, and Ray Owen knew that the reason was that the placenta was shared by twin cattle, something that had been discovered actually years before. Once they knew that, they figured that they could recapitulate this experiment of nature in other species. And at the time they moved to University College in London and took on Brent as a graduate student, they set out to recapitulate this experiment of nature in mice. And they thought it would be easy to do. It turned out to be tough because when they inoculated these mice with cells from a different strain of mouse, they had about 100% mortality. They were trying to do it by blind inoculation of the mice into the peritoneal cavity, trying to hit the unborn fetus and thus induce chimerism analogous to the situation in twin cattle. They couldn't do it. And then they discovered that if they made an incision just through the skin of the abdomen, that the peritoneum was semi-translucent, and they could see the fetuses in these pregnant mice, and they could hit those with a needle. Later on, they found that it was easy to do intravenously, but only because Billingham had made a trip to Philadelphia and had seen 30-gauge needles, which were necessary to do intravenous injections. But for the first experiments, they were doing it by inoculating these animals into unborn animals in the peritoneal cavity. And there was more of a story to that too, because their results were not very good. They had only a few mice at the time that had survived this inoculation and then grown up and been grafted with skin from the donor strain. So they had only a few mice. And a couple of things happened. One of their mice, which was one of just 2 or 3 that they had, escaped. And they had a terrible time catching that mouse. The other thing was that they found that their strains of mice had been mixed up. And they had some F1s that had been grafted. And fortunately, they discovered that after they, before the paper was published, but after they had submitted it, and they had time to do some more experiments and clear up the business about the F1 recipients. So that was the story of transplantation, I guess. I always thought, and Billingham would never say this, but I think he always thought that Ray Owen was the one who should have shared that prize, rather than Burnett, who had done theoretical and speculative writing about chimerism and tolerance, but had not done the experiments. Actually had failed to succeed when he had tried some similar experiments. But Ray Owen would never say that. Ray Owen just died during the last year. And he was a wonderful guy, and I had met him, but I didn't know him, and I was very interested in what a wonderful teacher he had been after he moved out to California from the University of Wisconsin. Billingham never talked about disappointment in not winning the Nobel Prize, although I'm sure he was, but he would never say that. And Medawar, of course, shared his prize money with Billingham and Brent. Billingham used his to pay for, or pay a lot of the price of, his house here in Philadelphia. It was a house that had a swimming pool, a small house, but had a swimming pool. And my wife and I and our young children used to stay there when Billingham went on vacation and use their swimming pool, so we knew about that. Brent, I think, bought a car with what he got of the shared Nobel Prize. The best work, or the most important work that he ever did, was the work with Medawar and Brent on neonatal tolerance. And I think, after all, that there would be a lot of people that would feel that that was the best work that was ever done in transplantation by anybody. And it certainly was the work that started off, or jump-started the field of experimental transplantation, and inspired a lot of people to get into transplantation. Well, I remember many of the conferences, that's for sure. The very first one in Paris was a marvelous experience. I was sent to that conference, and I was the only one from Penn who went. The reason being that Billingham and Silvers did not think there was much point in having a Transplantation Society. There were other meetings in immunology that they thought sufficed. And they didn't think there was they didn't think there was enough going on in transplantation to justify a Transplantation Society. The other project that I thought of as being a very good one was one that I did with Ali Naji and Jim Markman, in which we showed that the thymus is an immunologically privileged site. And it was not known to be an immunologically privileged site, and I'm not sure anybody would have ever thought to think that it might be, but it's such a big organ in young rats that it was an easy place to put pancreatic islets. And there aren't many places where you can transplant isolated pancreatic islets easily. And so we were doing it there and discovered by accident that it was an immunologically privileged site. And then, of course, the project went on to show that if you put foreign islets or foreign cells of other kinds into the thymus, they will actually induce tolerance. And so that was another project that I was quite proud of. Nobody seems to be too interested in it anymore, but from a historical standpoint, I think that was good. And I suppose that simply the persistence of activity in transplantation over almost half a century is something that was thought perhaps to be considered in awarding Nobel Prizes to people who were still around after that many decades.